Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Jeanette Pablo, the Director of the Climate Equity Initiative at Clean Air Task Force. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining our webinar on perspectives from environmental justice communities and national survey. As it says on the screen, this report is jointly done by BW Research and the Climate Equity Initiative and sponsored by Clean Air Task Force. So next slide. Founded in 1996, a Clean Air Task, I'm not going to read all this, by the way, everyone, just abbreviate it. But founded in 1996, Clean Air Task Force is a global clean air and climate nonprofit organization working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change. Our strategy has 5 key goals focused on 2 topics: reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing health impacting pollution by strengthening air quality emission standards and enforcement for power plants, oil and gas production, gasoline, diesel fuels, and other sources. Next slide. Clean Air Task Force launched the Climate Equity Initiative in May 2021 to conduct research and analysis working with environmental justice leaders, advocates, and community residents. Too often, proposed climate solutions are developed outside impacted communities and fail to respect the core needs of their residents. As a result, policies, programs, and community engagement initiatives can lack critical success elements, resulting in failed climate beneficial projects or perpetuating injustice and inequality. The Clean Air Task Force rejects the notion that such failures are inevitable. We recognize that responses to environmental degradation and climate change must consciously employ strategies that, to the maximum possible extent, benefit climate and promote environmental justice and community economic development. Next slide. We are grateful to be joined by 4 experts. Montina Cole is the principal of Jai Green Consulting. Her focus is at the intersection of integrated climate policy, racial equity and resilience, and holistic tools and solutions for sustainability. Montina was also the first senior counsel for environmental justice and equity at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where she helped lead the Environmental Justice and Equity Integration Initiative, including creation of the agency's first equity action plan. Sandy Fazeli is the Senior Managing Director at the National Association of State Energy Officials, where she leads programs supporting the state and territory energy offices in workforce, economic development, equity, access, and inclusion, as well as state and local cooperation on energy, climate, and resilience planning. Dr. Sakobi Wilson is a professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics in the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, College Park. He has over 20 years of experience as an environmental health scientist in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, community engaged research, including crowd science and community-based participatory research, water quality analysis, air pollution studies, built environment, industrial animal production, climate change, community resiliency, and sustainability. Phil Jordan, our last panelist and our presenter on the survey, is Vice President at BW Research, a leading firm in economic and workforce applied research with nationally recognized expertise in surveys, economic modeling, and forecasting and gap analysis. BW Research has designed and conducted more than 500 studies for public, private, and nonprofit organizations, both in the US and globally, with direct impact on federal, state, and local initiatives, including the recently released annual version of the US Energy and Employment Report for the US Department of Energy. Next slide, please. We're going to start our program with a filmed interview. As part of the Climate Equity Initiative's work, we are filming interviews of environmental justice leaders in 3 communities where our research is focused: Ironbound in Newark, New Jersey, in the Shiprock area of the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, and St. James and St. John the Baptist parishes in Cancer Valley in Louisiana. The reason we're starting for this 3-minute film is that it's a reminder that behind every one of our approximately 3,000 plus survey responses is a person living in an environmental justice community who took the time to share their views. Phil Jordan will then present on the report, followed by a panel discussion and Q&As. Just a few housekeeping notes. All participants have been muted to limit background noise during the presentation. but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. There are two ways to engage during the presentation. Please use the chat box for commentary or support and technical needs, and the Q&A box for questions for our panelists at the end of the session. Also, the presentation is being recorded today, and after the webinar, I'll send out an email with the report and the link to the recording. So Phil, would you please start the film? And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jeanette. I've probably seen that video now a couple of dozen times, and it's lost none of its impact. And I appreciate you including this as a preface to our presentation today, as that reminder that the purpose of this work is really to deeply understand how community engagement can lead to a better future than the past that we have come from. So today I'm going to be walking through briefly some of the results from a national survey of communities across the United States that really started as a launching off point for this project so that we could understand really the broad frameworks of the kinds of questions that we needed to be asking and understand the opinions and thoughts and top of mind concerns of folks across the United States from different types of environmental justice communities. As you can tell from the video and from the other work, that this is an ongoing process. So without going into lots of detail about what else is happening, as I mentioned, this is the sort of the framework to set up the initial research. Jeanette mentioned we've been doing a lot of work within the communities, the 3 communities that she mentioned, to go much more deeply, and then there'll be a lot more to come in terms of information sharing in the future. But today, we're going to focus on this national survey, and we're going to talk a little bit about why we did the survey and how we conducted it, what the topic areas were, and what some of the key findings are. And I'm going to go through this very fairly quickly because we really want to have some time for the panel to discuss those elements of the research that sort of jumped out to them that they want to explore further with the group. So I promise not to take too much time with dry survey data, so we can get into a rich discussion to follow. So really, as with any survey, right, what we're trying to understand is really sort of awareness and perceptions, but specifically concerns about environmental justice and pollution. And we did talk a lot about traditional energy infrastructure in those questions. We did want to understand how much was resonating with different communities about opportunities for economic and really job opportunities in clean energy. So if we think about a transition and a lot of the investments that are being made, are individuals aware of the different opportunities that exist, and how do they feel about those different technologies and industries? We also want to test social, community, and civic engagement, really understand who are the people that are trusted, who are the people that need to be brought into the conversation. And then also, again, looking at any specific challenges for folks as they think about this sort of transitioning job opportunity with in light of all of the recent federal and many states investing in this transition and new opportunity for clean energy. So as the kind of the very high level takeaways here is that we do see really significant concern over environmental issues and health risks. This is an area that has been, came through loud and clear in the survey research. It's been confirmed in the additional research that we've done within the communities. But really, a lot of what we're talking about is the health and environmental issues, and you could see that very clearly explained by Mr. Taylor in his filmed interview. And these concerns were significantly greater among non-white and Latino communities. Most survey participants were aware of some of the more common clean energy technologies. So solar and wind always ranked pretty high. Electric vehicles ranked pretty high. Many of the newer technologies, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or income, were not as well known. And there is general positivity about this transition to clean energy, but there are some significant barriers that folks are in need of addressing. Maybe a surprising finding, but white rural voters felt less able to influence decisions than urban higher income Latino or African American respondents, and that was borne out throughout regardless of geography, but just specifically for those rural voters. So this is a distribution of the responses. You can see we got responses from all across the United States, a good swath. And we focused on, as we said, specific communities, looking at communities of color, looking at communities with high environmental burdens, looking at low-income rural communities, tribal communities, et cetera. So really focusing on those. And what you see here is that we had a very good representation with obviously oversampling of some of the communities that we were most interested in hearing from. So to give you a little bit of perspective about, 3,000 plus survey responses, a really good A+ national survey for a presidential poll would have about 800 respondents. So this is a very, very robust data collection. And we're very careful to make sure that we not only oversampled, but also controlled for differences across a number of vectors. And you can see those here. So an oversampling in particular across these categories, but as you'll see here, and just as a quick note, when we look at race and ethnicity, we followed the Census Bureau guidelines for how they deal with race and ethnicity, which are not perfect. They don't always align with how people always think about it, but in order to be able to make sure that we were accurate and valid, we mirrored their methodology. So when it comes to ethnicity, according to the US government, you're either Hispanic or Latino or you're not. And then these are, then there's the races, which are distinct from that. So you'll see that there's obviously some overlap with Hispanic or Latinos identifying across different racial categories. Most of the respondents came from city and urban areas. This is because most people live in city and urban areas, but we did get good representation from suburban and rural areas as well. And then obviously we oversampled lower income individuals, lower income households, and so that we could understand some specific issues in the connection of poverty. So now I'm going to get into some of the findings. And this one is really, I think, an important one for the context of our work. So this is a question about trust for different information sources. And generally speaking, I mean, we're fairly low levels of trust across the board. But you can see that probably good news for many people on this call. Environmental organizations ranked pretty high with 25% of respondents. Then they had a lot of trust in environmental organizations, and about 37% saying some trust. It's probably not great though that greater than 30% have little to no trust either. So not a huge amount of trust being identified across any of these categories. One area that we were surprised with, because it has been a little bit different in our conversations more granularly, and why you have to always take a national survey and realize that you can learn things from it, but you really need to do the work in each community, is local faith leader, which was much lower than we had expected. And perhaps not surprisingly to many, but certainly a major challenge, is that the government, including local politicians, had the lowest level of reported trust, with a fairly healthy majority having little to no trust in their elected officials. This is obviously a big challenge, since particularly local governments are deeply engaged in how all of this plays out. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that as we go forward. As far as it comes to getting environmental news sources, a lot of reliance on traditional television and social media, with probably unsurprising declines in lower numbers in local newspapers and radio. The overall environmental concerns, when asked about how much you care about the environment, was fairly low. And it's sort of interesting, because there are certainly areas where the connection between environment and health were very strong. But I think similar to our experiences in the communities that we've been engaged with over the last year, we found that most of the way that the environmental concerns are viewed, the prism through which they're viewed through health impacts, as opposed to a general concern for the environment. When we talk about those environmental issues, you can sort of see where this plays out. Waste and garbage, water quality, air quality, and pollution are all things that were listed. These were all, we asked for sort of top of mind responses. So people, waste and garbage was spontaneously reported by almost a third of all respondents. So that's obviously a huge issue that just, these were not aided with any help. This was just people providing an open end. So certainly a very high findings here to see these kinds of numbers. Now, this is where we, it's sort of interesting that we see that where this connection is. So people are definitely in tune to the issues of and the connection of health impacts, environmental issues. About 50% seeing a moderate or major effect, and about 3/4, 65 to 75%, are saying that there's at least some effect, right, of these health impacts with environmental issues. So seeing this connection is something that is really high. Also interesting to note that when it comes to the connection between environmental issues, health impacts, and severe weather events, these communities were, higher, reporting higher connections, seeing connections between those than what you see in a lot of other literature and studies that are out in the general population. There again, this is highly dependent on where someone lives and what kind of community they're in. But again, seeing really concerning levels of folks who are have legitimate concerns about the health effects from pollutants in their community. And so you could look at that and say, well, only 20 to 30% strongly agree that environmental pollutants have affected the health of individuals in the neighborhood or affecting the health effects in the community. I mean, the goal, right, is for that to be zero, right? I mean, that's when legislation was passed 50 years ago around the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and hazardous waste laws. The point was to drive this to zero. So to me, at least, right, you don't think of this as like, do I like ice cream or not like ice cream? We shouldn't be having 20% plus of a population strongly agreeing that pollution in their community is leading to adverse health effects of people in their household or their neighborhood. That's an astronomically high number. So again, as we think back to Mr. Taylor's words, I think we see what we're really talking about here. So shifting gears a bit, we'll talk a little bit about clean energy perceptions. So by and large, these are pretty solid numbers for clean energy, meaning that the perception of clean energy as a general concept is fairly well received, with about 2/3 of respondents either somewhat or strongly agreeing that clean energy would have a lot of benefits for their communities, that it would create good jobs, that it would reduce environmental pollution, that they would like to see more clean energy. And then much lower numbers feeling that it would result in job losses in the community, though still obviously something that we'd have to keep an eye on, but much lower, about 1/3 of responses, slightly over 1/3 concerned about job losses. I will say this is consistent with all the other discussions that we've had as well, right? Where people are definitely, I would say, cautiously optimistic about opportunity with clean energy, as long as you're very specific about what kind of clean energy you're talking about. This is where we talked about the awareness question. So this was, again, if folks were able to identify any of these technologies, if they knew anything about them. On the one hand, I think the solar and wind are probably no surprise as more mature industries. Electric vehicles was not reported all that high, although that could also be based on how people are thinking about energy and really thinking about production more than anything else. Hydro, relatively high, but then when you start moving down to some other areas like carbon capture and green hydrogen, pretty low awareness around those. So definitely an area where there's a lot of education that needs to continue. This is a slide where we asked about whether or not people would be likely to apply for a renewable energy position or just a non-renewable, just a traditional energy position in their communities. And while the number for renewable energy job was slightly higher, they both are actually fairly high when you think about this as an industry perspective. I mean, most people, when you ask if they would be interested in applying for a job in XYZ industry, you don't get huge uptake. I mean, there was a national survey done a few years ago where like 7% of respondents said they would ever think about applying for a job in the construction sector. or 6% of millennials and Gen Z said that they would ever apply for a job in financial services sector, right? So to see something like 21.3% say they'd be very likely to apply for a renewable energy job in their community is pretty high. So I think this indicates that the word is spreading about some of these technologies. They're learning about them and they see them as an opportunity. So all the talk about jobs and economic opportunity from the transition does seem to be resonating in the community. At the same time, most folks have never actually considered it in the past. And very few have ever actually even searched for such an opportunity. So while there's optimism in the future, most have not ever considered working in the clean energy industry. Pretty even interest across the board among sort of cleaner technologies, so renewable energy, energy efficiency, and alternative transportation vehicles. Slightly lower in fossil fuel energy. Again, this is regionally specific as well. But certainly some interest across different types of careers. Though we do have some barriers that we need to address. And so part of the reason why folks are answering the way that they're answering around clean energy is that they don't know a lot about the positions, they don't know a lot about the technologies, and they don't really know where to start. So only, not too many of the respondents are able to, talk about what the clean energy job opportunities are and where they are. Most of them think that they do not have the education or training that's needed to apply for the job. Generally speaking, there are other challenges as well. And so in these communities, we really have, as we're thinking about sort of a comprehensive strategy for how we include communities in the economic benefit that can come from a transition, there are all kinds of issues around financial resources and trauma of poverty issues that we need to focus on. So a large, 2/3 of respondents reported that it was a challenge that they had things like, some combination of transportation, childcare, housing, and security, and need financial resources to continue to move forward. Getting that relevant industry experience, getting through the schooling that needs to be done, getting access to professional resources, all things that are really challenging. Access to a computer was fairly low, but still important. Access, so broadband and computer access is important. And then I will just mention the prior conviction. This is a huge issue that we absolutely need to address. The number of folks who have a prior conviction that is precluding them from work is way too high, and especially when we're talking about very large numbers of people from a very long time ago who have nonviolent offenses that are still hanging over them. And so working through core reform and other while it's lower on the list, it is a big challenge for folks in some communities. In terms of civic engagement, we found that participation engagement is important to folks, and somewhat agreement right around that they're able to influence local policy outcomes. So it's interesting that it's slightly more important than they think they can actually have influence on, and that actually is really consistent with a lot of the environmental justice leaders and community members who we met with, who are basically saying like, well, if they don't listen to me the first time, I'm just going to keep coming at them until they listen to me, right? And so that level of engagement is really critical and sort of part of the fabric of many of these communities. Again, the frequency of events is a lot of issues, awareness, raising issues and awareness of community issues through social media and the internet, and direct campaigns, and even some direct lobbying. So I think I got in just like 18 seconds under the time. So I'm sorry that was so quick, but we really want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about reflections and reactions with the panel. So with that, I will stop my screen share and turn it back over to Jeanette.
So Phil, just one question. Somebody asked, will it be, we'll do most of the questions at the end, but will it be possible to view survey results by state or region?
Yeah, so we have a variety of breakdowns, even with 3,000 responses. When you get too granular on multiple vectors, the validity sort of falls apart a bit, right? So our sample size becomes too small and our margin of error becomes too high. So certainly regional analysis, but when you start to break out sort of specific groups, so if you wanted to say like, do we have data that can tell you about how, Asian Americans in New England felt? No. But we certainly can talk about more regional breakdowns as well.
Great. Okay, so for our panel, Montina and Sandy and Phil and Professor Wilson. So I have two questions. I'll let you choose which one you want to answer first, and then we can go to the next one. So the two questions are, what did you find that was the most unexpected information from the report, or most striking because it confirmed a major concern you had? That's one choice. Another choice is, would you like to discuss a particular finding or data point of special interest typically associated with your professional experience? So Montina, would you like to start?
Sure, happy to. Thanks very much, Jeanette. And let me just say, it's really a pleasure to be with you all today, with all of my all-star co-panelists and everybody that's tuning in today. I really commend the Clean Air Task Force for its climate equity initiative and the new report on these survey findings regarding environmental justice community perceptions and concerns that so many have about these important issues. They're very relevant to the transition to clean energy that we so much need. If we're serious about the clean energy transition being successful, which includes being equitable, if we're serious about environmental justice, about energy justice, climate justice, if we're serious about doing things the right way, then, and including everybody, then our work must include the kind of work that you're doing in terms of listening to environmental justice communities so that these communities can help to inform and influence the way forward. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for the work. In terms of the question, I think I'm going to answer the question about what did I find was the most unexpected information from the report. One of the things that really caught my eye about the report was the finding concerning the most trusted sources of information, the trust issue. And so the finding that showed that scientists, family members and friends, environmental organizations, and others were among the most trusted sources of information when we're talking about sources of information for community environmental issues. Scientists, I have to say, it was a little surprising for me, but very gratifying to see them among the most trusted sources. And I say it's surprising, it shouldn't have been surprising, right? But it is because there's been a strand of thinking in our country that doesn't necessarily value science, scientific thoughts, findings of scientists. And that's reflected in climate denialism and much more. But the thinking that sometimes seems to predominate is the thinking that gives value to whatever's the flavor of the day on social media platforms. So I was just really gratified to see, and a little bit surprised and very gratified to see that in the survey result, especially in these times where we know that science and truth is often attacked, discounted, or censored. Also, environmental organizations. I was really pleased to see that environmental organizations were among those that were valued as well. A little bit surprised, but very pleased, especially as somebody who worked for an environmental organization. I think that historically, there's been the view and the concern that environmental organizations are perhaps more purely focused on nature and animals, right? The polar bears and not people. And I think that things have been changing. As we have been seeing environmental organizations broaden their thinking and their focus to be more comprehensive and holistic, and to focus on impacts on people, including those who are disproportionately suffering from harm, environmental justice communities. So now we see that there's many partnerships, many meaningful partnerships between traditional environmental organizations and EJ organizations and communities, which is great. Of course, there's still opportunities to keep improving, keep learning from communities for sure. But it was just a great data point, I think, for environmental organizations, and that they should use as they continue to seek to build relationships and to partner with communities, especially as we see that we want to make sure that Justice 40 is implemented, that environmental justice communities, disadvantaged communities are entitled to get some of this unprecedented funding that's coming through the climate bill, bipartisan infrastructure law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, to make sure that they're partnering with them in a good way, and so that EJ communities can really share in the benefits. I know that's a lot of work that that environmental organizations are doing more of these days, and partnering with the community. So this is just a good data point, I think, that to support them in that work. So it was just really good to see those two categories reflected in that way. This work, I think, really takes a village, lots of different people, and I was glad to see that they were, they were amplified in this way.
Thank you. Sandy?
Great. Yeah. Well, first off, I'd like to just echo Montina. It's an honor to be here with everyone. And also just congratulate the Clean Air Task Force and BW Research Partnership on a really interesting, informative report. I thought it was chock full of great insights, and it's one that I think can really help expand the body of knowledge around this very complex issue of community and environmental justice. Just to share a little bit of background about me, I'm a senior managing director at the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASIO. We're a membership association for the 56 energy offices in the states, territories, and the District of Columbia. And typically our members are just designated by their governors to lead energy policy and program design and development and planning, often looking at forward-looking policy directions as opposed to other counterparts in regulatory agencies like public services commissions. And because my day-to-day work is so heavily focused on the work of state governments and the energy and climate arena, I too was drawn to the statistic about the sources of information. And the finding that sat with me the most was the extremely low level of trust in government as an information source. More than 50% of respondents reported having little or no trust in government officials, which I thought was interesting. I think it would be much easier to accept the statistic if government didn't play such a critical role in matters that ultimately impact environmental and climate justice. So I think it just speaks to a real need on the part of governments to build trust and competence in community engagement and communication. Because the reality is that a lot of decisions, a lot of investments will be flowing through or influenced by government, especially state and local governments. We're in a really unique moment right now where the federal government is mobilizing historic levels of funding and incentives for clean energy and climate change. But the implementation really does come down to the state and local governments, either taking action to pursue funds, adjusting or modernizing their existing policies and programs, encouraging their businesses and households to take advantage of the funds. And that really cannot happen successfully without listening closely to the needs of the communities and the constituents that could benefit the most from the investments. Fortunately, and I'm happy to revisit this during the later parts of the discussion, we are seeing some solutions that states are experimenting with, especially in the orbit of my organization with state and territory energy officials, moving to develop better strategies to build trust at the community and individual level, and really building transparency too when there isn't necessarily full deference to community members, but the opportunity to create accountability and trust between those levels of government and decision making. So thanks for the question, and I'll pass it along to Dr. Wilson.
Professor Wilson, please share your views.
Yeah, thank you. So I too just talk about what was a little alarming was the trust issue. And I think part of it gets to, even with the levels that we saw with the environmental groups, et cetera, I think we've seen erosion in trust in the scientific enterprise and government. And there's been erosion in trust in communities I work in for decades because of scientific exploitation, right? Government malfeasance. You think about the book Color Law, how unequal we have unequal protection under the law. And you think about a lot of environmental injustice that has occurred because of unequal protection under the law, whether it be Flint, comply with the lead and copper rule of the Safe Drinking Water Act, right? If it comes to how the Clean Air Act has been implemented and comply with or not comply with, you see differential compliance, differential application of the law. Even with Supreme Court cases, right? It looks like we're creating discriminatory opportunities for certain groups. And it looks like we're not really adhering to that equal protection under the law. And even human rights frames, if you apply those to this work, in environmental justice, you see a erosion in trust, a lack of trust, because folks have been dehumanized in communities that we work in, right? And some of the communities that we mentioned, you look at the folks down in St. James Parish in Louisiana, in Cancer Alley. What made those communities where you want to put these petrochemical operations? What was it? Was it the value of the land? It was cheaper? It's because the people who lived there were dehumanized. It was saying less than human. So for me, we talk about environmental justice, and the original intent of President Clinton's executive order on environmental justice and original Office of Environmental Justice. It was about environmental racism, right? And to compromise, they talked about environmental justice. Was really what we're talking about. And to be really serious, everybody, we're talking about environmental slavery, okay? Because folks have been used for harms and not getting the goods, right? Over multiple decades, because of their skin color, because of their income, because of who they are, they've been invisibilized and dehumanized, and then but commodified, right? So we're talking about environmental slavery. So environmental justice is too light of a term. Environmental racism is too light of a term. It's environmental slavery. So I'm gonna stop on that soapbox of mine. But getting to what I wasn't surprised by were the results about, folks' health concerns. Look at the Canadian wildfires, right? And the wildfire smoke and the impacts on human health. Look at the compounding impacts of living in the Gulf Coast in Texas, and you're dealing with a heat wave, but you also have other underlying conditions, the intersectionality of that. People understand what they're experiencing and their health impacts. So think about those who are most susceptible, right? Children and elderly, pregnant women, those are most vulnerable, outdoor workers, or folks that may have some extrinsic factors, social, economic vulnerability. They're going to have differential climate risks, right? And differential climate impacts, differential environmental impacts because of those underlying social and economic vulnerability. And many of it's due to, in many ways, race and racism. As Dr. Bo was saying, some folks have the complexion for protection, some people don't. And when it comes to funding, right, we're talking about Justice 40, some folks have a complexion for investments and some don't. We'll see how well Justice 40 works. But getting back to the health impacts, we know that folks who are experiencing, as from the survey, you see communities of color saying, yeah, we believe there's a problem here. We see connection between our environmental exposures and health effects. So you think about chemical exposures like air pollution, whether it be particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, black carbon, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, or hazardous air pollutants, right? We know they have adverse health effects, but then you add on a physical stressor like heat. So the combination of pollution and heat, they both kill, but together they're impacting more people. And we see the millions of Americans who are impacted now, but think about the millions of Americans who are impacted every day by air pollution. The millions of Americans are impacted every day by chemical pollution. Millions of Americans have been poisoned every day. That's what you see reflected in the survey, that we are not doing enough to protect our most vulnerable and our most susceptible. And hopefully Justice 40 and its administration, you'll see the implementation of those plans work out. But we know, and I'm gonna pass the mic after I say this, we know with the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act, we got those acts passed, but the implementation is where we fell down, which is why we are what we are in this country with the erosion of those rights. We must see what the implementation looks like, not at the federal level, but at the state and local level, to make sure we address those harms and get to some restorative justice, some reparative justice, reparations. I'll just be clear, succinct, reparations. Go ahead.
Thank you. Phil?
I would say that I'm not sure if it was a surprise, but an important takeaway from the work. And I think I'm not gonna say it any better than Professor Wilson did, certainly, which is that in this space, because of everything that we just heard, hiding behind whether you're a scientist or an environmental organization or a local politician is not going to be the thing that gets you the trust. And so an environmental organization, we've heard in the communities, that can be spoken of really well, that can be spoken of really poorly. And so individual connections and building trust on an individual level to make sure that you're doing the work so that the communities know or start to get a sense of, and it obviously does take time and effort, right? That this is not about scientific exploitation. This is about something else. And if it is, they're gonna figure it out. Like they know what's going on in their communities. So I think that for me, what really the sort of the key takeaway that was most powerful, and again, maybe surprising, but now after being in the communities for a year, it's fairly obvious, is that there is no one size fits all approach to any of this. And there's some really helpful information here, but the nuance in the layers underneath all of these data is really what's so critical. And when you start recognizing that the folks that are responding to this are responding largely from sacrifice zones, right? And have been the ones who have been sacrificed for these siting decisions and for the other activities that have happened there. You realize that there is not a simple approach, and you are not going to rely on a single name brand and say that's going to get me access to trust. Trust is something that needs to be built genuinely. It needs to be built with authenticity, and it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes commitment. And I mean, we've seen it over and over again, and you could see it in some of the results in the survey. They know how to sniff. They'll know how to sniff it out if you're not genuine, right? And it's not going to go well. So a half measure is not worth anybody's time. It's not going to get anything done.
Very profound. Thank you. So Martina, do you want to maybe just say a couple of words about something else about the report, or frankly, I'd be interested in any connection to your work at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that you see connected with this kind of research. It doesn't have to be this specific one, but next steps maybe.
Sure. Happy to talk about some connections with my past work at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Another finding that stuck out to me, and it's related to FERC and to other government entities too that do permitting, was the finding, and this was heartening, finding that lots of the folks who responded to the survey would approve citing new clean energy infrastructure in their communities. They would approve it. And if I'm not mistaken, Phil, I think it's like maybe a total of 65%, so well over, a good majority. And this is important to lift up, because oftentimes we see EJ communities in particular being put out there as the boogeyman, as these are the people who are taking, slowing down our processes and things like that, or NEPA's the boogeyman. The process takes too long. The thing is, when there's something that's going to be good for the community, people want that. EJ communities aren't folks who are just out there saying no to everything. So that was good to see that finding. But key to making sure that we are able to get expeditious siting of infrastructure that will facilitate renewable energy transmission lines. Key to that is making sure that we are engaging with environmental justice folks in the way that we should, and that we are having meaningful engagement with communities. Studies have shown when it comes to slowdown, so-called, when it comes to siting of transmission and other forms of infrastructure, that a lot of times it boils down to not engaging with community or not doing it in an appropriate way, not meaningfully. Just calling a meeting and saying, y'all show up, we're going to, tell you about this project, and then counting that as engagement. That's not engagement. We want to make sure that communities are informed early throughout the process to the very end, and not just informed, but engaged to get their opinions, so that they can have impact and information that helps to inform any changes that may be needed for the project, or whether or not the project's even appropriate. So we have to treat folks the way we want to be treated, basically the golden rule, right? Treat people as partners. These are the people who are already overburdened with too much infrastructure in their communities. So we have to make sure that we're really engaging in meaningful engagement. I think that, an agency like FERC now has a very good opportunity, seeing the very disheartening finding of the report that government is at the bottom of the list in terms of trust, to be able to see this as an opportunity to do better. I think government generally, gets this rap, and it's not necessarily an unfair rap. Why? Because government has enabled racism from the very beginning, has enabled in the form of redlining, Jim Crow, to the very beginning, slavery, but the legacy of all those things still are with us, as Dr. Wilson very, very artfully described the conditions today. So we have to be able to show that we are honest brokers. And one way to do that, just at a 101 fundamental level, is making sure that we're engaging better with communities. At FERC, there's a relatively new office, the Office of Public Participation, which is really wonderful. It's an office that's there to help engage people who don't have big lawyers to represent them, like utilities do and like developers do, to make sure these folks can engage in a more equal footing, right? So to continue to build up that office will be very important. That is one of the things that's a requirement under the Equity Action Plan, which I was very pleased to lead that effort, among other things, when I was there as the first Senior Counsel of Environmental Justice and Equity. But they need to make sure that they implement that plan. And one of those key pieces is to make sure that OPP is really solidified. Another thing that they could do also is to consider, and I hope ultimately adopt, intervenor funding. so that it's very good and well if you have the good processes in place and say, everybody come, people who haven't been involved, come and be involved, but you don't have the resources, you don't have the millions of dollars that developer X does. So to have a mechanism where interveners, communities can have the resources and the funding to be able to participate in a more meaningful way, that will really make a difference, I think. So these are just, some examples. We could talk about many more, but those are a couple of things that I will call out.
Thank you very much. Sam, did you want to give some examples about what some of the states are doing, or, some of the innovation that's developed recently in terms of working better or with communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the themes that I really took away from the report as it relates to my own work is about how to imbue these findings into governance, specifically around stakeholder engagement and deference and climate and energy justice. And so I began thinking about, I think, a few aspects of that question of governance. And I think one piece of it is really around acknowledging the issue, and also acknowledging the role of state institutions and local institutions in advancing problematic systems that have marginalized specific communities. And I think one really interesting example in my hometown of Minneapolis, a few years ago, the city council passed a resolution recognizing racism as a public health emergency. And that's now imbued into the advisory councils that work with the mayor, the administrative actions that the city does, the lawmaking. Of course, it's still, I think, at a symbolic level. And so the implementation, as Professor Wilson noted, is still in progress. But I think even just that first foundational step of acknowledging racism and climate and environmental racism is critical. Another piece really is around multi-agency and interagency coordination at the state and local level. What I found from the report is that communities don't experience these issues in silos, right? Pollution, air quality, energy cost, energy opportunities for jobs. They are all part of one's, individual or community experience. And similarly, at the government level, certainly it makes sense maybe for specific agencies to lead on climate or resilience, but bringing in economic development, workforce, emergency management, zoning and permitting, housing to the table to create more integrated solutions that make sense to communities is another really important step. Third, I think, too, around good governance is understanding how policies and investments sequence and interact with one another. It's really hard to have meaningful community engagement and accountability when it results in empty promises. You can't have a community solar program without strong interconnection processes or enabling legislation or buy-in from utilities. You can't really electrify a home without first addressing health and safety improvements, wiring upgrades that are needed, energy inefficiencies in the home that then help set it up for an electrified household, like with a heat pump. And then finally, I think the last piece of this, and this is the moment that we're in right now, is using the power of the purse. Governments have access to funding, procurement and purchasing processes that can help to support living wages, minority and women-owned businesses, local hire, and prioritizing investments in historically marginalized communities. And I think that's really the way to get these numbers, hopefully in time, to change, to create more trust, but more so to actually create opportunities for better health and economic outcomes as a result of the changes that are made.
Great. Professor Wilson, do you have any follow-up, or we talked earlier yesterday about some of the screens that you've been developing. Would you like to maybe share a little bit about that?
Yeah, before I go there, I do want to add to my colleagues, fellow panelists' comments. I think the survey about community engagement is that part is very important. And I didn't say earlier because I was, saying multiple things, but the civic engagement, I just want to say that if I didn't say it before, that was a little alarming, because people said that the mainly way of civic engagement was internet. I don't even call that civic. I would never call it even civic engagement. Social media to me is not being civically engaged. To me, you got to be using Ike and Mike. That's your left foot and your right foot. You know what I'm saying? Just use your feet. You got to be, my point is, you got to be active. To me, that's a passive form of engagement. It's a maybe not passive. It's a not personal form of engagement. And we take about, I always say, if you want to make a democracy work, you have to put in the work. And to me, that's not putting in the work to make your democracy work, particularly at the local level. Going to the zoning board meeting, right? Going to the town council meeting. You may sign a petition and sign a GoFundMe campaign, but to me, that's like really that's a low bar. If you want to say that it's on a continuum of civic engagement, that may be easily accessible. Civic engagement, a low bar accessibility, but in my opinion, unless you have a whole bunch of numbers and it's multi-pronged by itself, some of those things are low impact civic engagement too. So showing up and being in person in a meeting, being part of an organization, like where, so we said we value environmental organizations, other organizations, but their participation in organizations. So how do we uplift and support those anchor institutions, those grassroots organizations, those churches, faith groups, other faith groups, other respected entities to be more engaged? One of the things I have to say, how do we activate them? They may be in another issue to be in this space. Because communities have a lot of infrastructure, but the empowerment framework, how do you empower folks? How do you activate the infrastructure to be more engaged in these issues that we're talking about? So I think that's efficient. And then we talk about trust. They're already trusted entities, right? And so in a lot of the work, and I'll come back around to your question about screens, in a lot of the work that we're doing, for example, we're trying to build hyperlocal air quality. We're not trying, we are building hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks. And you think about the issues of, environmental justice and climate change, right? We have greenhouse gas emissions, of course, as combustion byproduct. A lot of those co-pollutants are what I mentioned before, like criteria air pollutants that impact human health, like hazardous air pollutants. So we're monitoring, not all of those things. We're monitoring particulate matter in some networks, using purple areas. We're monitoring other networks with folks at Hopkins and Curtis Bay, for example. We're looking at other pollutants of concern as well. We're trying to look at ozone with NO2, like multi-pollutant, like sensor networks, sensor sites, right, in our networks. But the point is, we really want to make sure that, we're doing community science in that, and that also is building trust, community members doing their own science, but also getting data that's actionable, okay? And working with anchor institutions. So frontline, fence line, grassroots organizations, for example. One of our projects, some of our hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks, we're working with churches, the AME Church, United Church of Christ. We're also trying to engage NAACP chapters because of all the, the infrastructure, again, that social justice infrastructure that we have. We're trying to work with Panhandle Council. For those of you may or may not know, that's the historic African-American sororities, fraternities. Again, infrastructure. So there's other infrastructure in other communities that can be engaged. They've been working more on social justice, education, recidivism. But in many ways, when the work that they're doing and the work that we do, particularly environmental justice, if you look at the octopus as an octopus of oppression, they may be working on one tentacle, right? If y'all get that, y'all can use that one too. It's an octopus of oppression. So how do you connect and bridge, right? And make sure that, like, if you're working on fighting against anti-LGBT stuff, or folks who are against reproductive justice, right? Folks who are Islamophobes, right? It's the arm of the octopus of oppression. So if we can bridge across that, even that social justice activism, I think that's important too, to build trust, to humanize folks, to build a larger tent and a larger movement. So I just want to say that, because I forgot to say that earlier because I was talking too much. So I want to come back around and say that. Now, as it relates to the tools, when you think about how do we empower folks with tools, we are developing a lot of mapping tools and screening tools. I would say that the air quality monitoring networks by themselves are a set of tools that we can train folks in a community science perspective to use, right? And we're doing that. But when it comes to mapping tools, we have developed a Maryland EJ screen. Some of you may be familiar with US EPA EJ screen. So we have a state level mapping tool. We also developing, working with folks in CGIS, one of the units on campus at UMD, on the climate equity mapping tool for the state of Maryland. We've also worked for Maryland Department of Natural Resources. We help update their park equity tools. So think about mitigation and green infrastructure. That's a useful tool. And then we worked with the National Academy of Medicine, the Grand Challenge on Climate Change and Health Equity. I think that's the Grand Challenge. They have a new program called a Climate Communities Network. So we helped to develop a mapping interface to look at climate risks across the country using the NCA5 regions, the National Climate Assessment Study 5 regions. And we did it for the whole country. And we found that I think the Upper Plain states had the highest kind of score. And I believe the South, I think the Gulf Coast had the next highest score. And so we looked at, various climate hazards, populations of concern like children, the elderly, low income, linguistically isolated, indigenous folks, Asian Pacific Islanders, Black folk and others who have been marginalized, who have been dumped on, or, been overburdened in this country. And we looked at the health impacts of those populations, created an index and created a score, right? And that was given to that team to help them with their climate communities networks. They can basically select communities to be a part of that climate communities network. But we're leveraging that national interface to build a regional interface for the Mid-Atlantic. So we can then identify communities of concern that have high climate risks, prioritize them, and micro-target them for resources, whether it be partnerships, bringing in sensors, or whether it be Justice 40 type of investments and benefits. So I just want to share. So you have to think about these tools, the fit for purpose. These are mainly screening tools. They're not going to show causality, but they can be used to identify, prioritize, and micro-target communities for interventions, whether it be educational, policy, financial, workforce development, energy sovereignty, clean energy investments, et cetera.
Thank you. I'm really glad you said that, because I think these tools are so valuable and can really, like you said, you didn't say make a difference, but you indicated, but it can identify like what approaches we can take to address some of these communities' experiences with knowledge. So let's see. Phil, do you want to make some comments? And I think there's a couple questions that probably in the chat, in the Q&A that you would be able to answer.
Sure,
Yes.
happy to do that. So I just wanted to respond. The octopus tentacles got me thinking about another finding. We're not able to have a slide for everything in the report, but one of the things that's come up a lot in the communities and was evident in the survey, a little bit of a different take on the sort of the tentacles, is that a lot of the communities feel as though they've been intentionally siloed to reduce their power to connect. So there's a massive amount of power that's available from helping communities to connect and engage with one another. And it's a really important part of the work. So one way that we can think about, increasing civic engagement, increasing power, increasing, the agency to make good change is not only like, who are the developers and government agencies and environmental groups who need to be part of the conversation, but how do we look at communities, like Mr. Taylor's group, which is a handful of people in rural Louisiana trying to shut down a multi-billion-dollar chemical plant. How do we create the structures so that people can connect? And it got me thinking about this broader effort around community benefits planning and community benefits agreements, and just a couple of quick things that this survey sort of helped me to think about in terms of that framework. One is, most of these communities, what they're really talking about, as we said a number of times, is health impacts and reducing emissions. So that's kind of top of mind issue. Another thing is, I think Professor Wilson talked about, is just having, nice stuff, right? Like green space and not having the community be full of just sacrifice zone activities, but having things that are good, positive benefits in the community and wanting those to be there. Montina talked about the job opportunities that could exist, but making those really meaningful. So what does that actually mean for a community? Those things are kitchen table and pocketbook issues. They want to be healthy. They want to be able to earn a living, right? And so as we think about all these different pieces, really trying in every step of the process to think the community benefits plan needs to benefit that community, right? And what that community wants needs to be front and center. And connecting those communities in different ways, as I said earlier, can really help for those communities to learn from each other when they're often very small organizations that are trying to represent groups of people. So I just wanted to throw those out because the comments of my fellow panelists really triggered those things in my mind. I want to just mention those quickly. I'm going to hit on a couple of the Q&As from the chat, and then I'm going to, I think, leave some for others. But so we had a couple of questions about the level of aggregation and what we could see for data. And so the way that we used census tracts as the unit of measure for how we were organizing where respondents are, and then we used data around those census tracts to classify them into these different groups. So they're aggregated as such. So currently, the way that we've aggregated would be, rural versus urban versus suburban, or communities of color, white, rural, low income communities, those kinds of things. State would be, as I mentioned earlier, state would be very hard to do, but we could certainly look at doing some regional analyses. They don't exist sort of off the shelf, but we could look at some regional analyses and see what exists there. Also, because most of the tools are census tract based, I think there is a lot that we could do with aggregations among census tracts that are within or outside of disadvantaged communities or other, however they're classified in different states. So definitely an area we could look at, but is not currently processed that way. We have to look and see what we'd be talking about with sample sizes, but definitely something that could be very interesting. And then we had a question based on the trust scores based on racial demographics. So interesting finding, and this may be the result of that they're fairly generic terms that we're testing. As I mentioned, environmental group can mean one thing to one person and something to someone else. We didn't see tremendous variation in differences across racial and ethnic groups. We did see trends where, like Hispanic and Latinos were generally more trusting than non-Hispanic Latinos, or Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander respondents had lower levels of trust across the board. But the differences of who they trusted were not significantly different. What was significantly different was the responses by income level and by the type of community you live in, meaning rural folks had very low levels of trust for everybody. And people living in urban areas and people at higher incomes had higher levels of trust across the board. So sort of interesting dynamics there. Again, I think this is something where you could spend a lot of time focused just on this issue of trust in the survey and get a lot more detail. So we don't want to draw really broad, we don't want to draw detailed conclusions from broad data, but very interesting. And it really does, as I mentioned in my comments before, it really does go back to sort of putting in the work on the trust. The video was very powerful. I totally agree. The other communities that we referenced, you may have heard it since you asked the question. So the video came from St. John the Baptist Parish, which is in Cancer Alley, which is west of New Orleans in Louisiana. The Shiprock area of the Navajo Nation is the other area, and there will be filmed interviews done later this summer in that area. And then the third community is Ironbound, which is a neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, adjacent to the port of Newark. And those interviews have been completed and I believe are in the editing stage. So those are those communities. And then I will, I think there's one more question about reparations and racism. And so maybe I'll, and some specifically for Professor Wilson. So maybe Jeanette, I don't know if you want to handle the next couple of questions. Yeah.
So, Phil, I don't know if you saw, is the data publicly available in a usable format?
Well, usable format is always an interesting question. So we do not have it available like as microdata because we have not scrubbed the potentially personal identifying information. And we'd have to go through some hoops to figure out exactly how it could be used, but certainly happy to work with you, Jeanette, on any requests that come into you on making data available for use. And then do you want me to hit the qualitative research question too, or?
Sure.
So within these three communities, we have done as a team, when I say we, the full Clean Air Task Force Initiative has done an enormous body of qualitative research with multiple site visits to each community. We've done focus groups, a number of focus groups in each community. Focus group participants are given a $250 gift card for 90 minutes of their time. They're paid as consultants because we believe that their input is critical and they are feeding the team and should be paid the same as anybody else working on the project. We've worked closely with local community groups. So Concerned Citizens St. John, Rise St. James, the Descendants Project, which actually to Professor Wilson's comments about the connection between their whole focus is from plantations to plants, as well as Ironbound Community Corporation and others. So we've done a lot of that work ongoing over the last year, and we have more to come. That will be coming out. That will be more quantitative work, as well as economic analyses and other pieces that will be part of this work. So lots more going on there. Jeanette, I'll kick it to you now.
Sure. So a lot of our research is going to be finalized in the fall or winter, and we have all your emails, and we'll send out information when that becomes available. We typically have about 4 or 5 video. I'm answering a lot of questions at once. 4 or 5 filmed interviews for each community. It's uncertain what will happen in the Navajo Nation because that culture is has some strong opinions, or I don't know how to say it right, but we will be asking anyone who wishes to volunteer to be interviewed. If they're comfortable with that, then of course we'd be happy to do so, but it's not a goal. I think 2 of the questions in the question and answer are about language and racism. And so the first question is actually more about the language, I can't say that word right now. That language is not appropriate for, nobody wants to be called disadvantaged. Nobody wants to be called, marginalized. So, we actually went through a whole effort trying to identify language that was respectful and appropriate. And, that's why we call them environmental justice communities. It's very inclusive of food insecurity, low income, a wide range of things. Disadvantaged is a legal term. It's got a definition associated with it, which makes people more comfortable. But it does actually is viewed to imply that the fault lies with the community as opposed to external forces, which is why we rarely use it. That term, it's usually for early research where that's where we were then using it. I think it's so anyway, and so language really matters. You have to really think about it when you're talking to other people or working with communities. And it doesn't take much time to look on the internet and identify things that you may not think are offensive, but they are, or vice versa. So,
and can I chime in that really quick? I think part of it is sometimes it's hard because you have the government definitions, as you said, even census, how we collect data through the census and delineation, delineation. So you want to capture numbers. Even the terms, when we use the term minority, I'm trying to shift away from using, I don't like the term minority at all because it's disempowering, but from a government data collection, it's used. So when it comes to the processes of power issues, like minoritized populations is a term that folks are using. Disadvantage is used a lot because that's in this current frame with this Executive Order 1408 and Justice 40 and how the CEQ, the scorecard and the CJIS tool is about disadvantage. And so the WEJAC, which has a lot of environmental justice leaders, they went through a long process of how do you delineate what are the indicators that go into disadvantage, because it's a government. Not saying they wanted to use that, but it was imposed upon them, right? But when you think about vulnerability is extrinsic. You're not born like, even saying EJ communities, I try to shift it to say communities with EJ issues to keep it external, right? So you want to keep it external. You want to try to, as much as possible, use terms to keep it external. Now, a lot of folks now say this, I'll pass my back to you to answer the next question, but even, people of color versus BIPOC versus being very specific about the racial ethnic group or whatever group you're talking about, you want to do that, but sometimes it's easier to kind of collapse because a whole lot of words may make it too technical, too jargony. But language is very important. And I'll say this and pass the mic back. Whoever we're working for, let them define what they want to be called, right? And that's an important part of where the qualitative comes in to inform a lot of these structures and processes. So, and that's what that gets to that representative justice. Communities speak for themselves. You think about 17 principles of environmental justice and having people self-define who they are and what they want to be called. I think it's really, really important too.
Thank you. I completely agree. So our last question is, I'm going to read it and then I'll make one sentence and then I'll invite anybody else to comment. So So words like reparations and racism may scare a lot of people. Even though the racial bias for all of this is clear, do you worry that using these terms may make some people push back from the table and get less done in the end for local communities? So my sentence is, if you're working in this space and you're not a little bit uncomfortable, you're probably not doing the good job that you could do. And I think we do have to, I recognize people sometimes do find it fearful to discuss these terms, but I think that's where we have to go. We need to be comfortable using these terms because they are facts. But I invite anyone else to make a comment on the panel. Martina?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Jeanette. I think that we have to be very aware of the world that we're living in, right? We live in times of a lot of inconvenient and uncomfortable truths, but truth is important. Truth is necessary, right? We don't want to be censoring the truth. We'll find ourselves in a situation where I've read recently the Tulsa race riot and massacre from the 1920s is now being, somebody put out the idea that that had nothing to do with race. But that's where we can find ourselves, right? If we kind of just try to whitewash things. It's important for us to know if somebody is, if a certain group is disproportionately impacted in an adverse way. We want to know those things so that we can, so that we can have policy to address that. And also it's important for us to keep in mind there's not just these communities that are impacted. Racism, environmental racism, other forms of racism impact us all ultimately. It's a societal thing that impacts us all negatively. So we're all really in this together. So we should not be afraid to call out things as they are, of course, in respectful ways and, appropriate ways, but we can't not, talk about the truth. If we were talking about elephants being harmed, we wouldn't say, oh, the creature with the big ears. And, we would say, we would call it an elephant. So we have to call things for what they are.
Thank you, Martina. That's very well stated. So we're at time. Does anyone else want to say a last word on the panel? Or
Jeanette, I was just going to say very quickly that just to add to this, because from a research perspective, the communities themselves, this is the terms that they're using and they see it and they know what it is. And, you've been there, you saw it, and one of the respondents in a focus group pointed to his skin color and said that's why it's happening. So you understand the sort of the thrust of the question, but also to have that genuine conversation and to really be a trusted partner. When someone tells you the thing that's happening to them every day, I think it's really important that you listen to them and believe them.
thank you. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks. A great panel. I really appreciate all your thought and time and effort and insights. And thank you so much for the participants. We look forward to seeing you again, probably in September with maybe our next webinar. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.